This is the Dr. Casey Show, and tonight we are tackling the hard-hitting issues of sports concussions after USC's Ray Lechuga reported sustaining a concussion in last week's game against Stanford, but stayed in anyway because it seems that he didn't report his symptoms. To answer some questions about sports concussions, the facts, and, well, I called one of the best, Dr. Dave Lechuga. He's a neuropsychologist. He's the doctor for the LA Kings and former president of the California Psych Association. Dave, thanks for joining me on the first episode of the Dr. Casey Show.
It's my pleasure. I appreciate you having me.
Oh, thanks so much. So I kind of wanted to start things off on a real basic level for some of the parents and coaches listening who've heard about concussions. And let's start with the basic one. What exactly is the definition of a sports concussion?
Well, concussion is it's a trauma-induced alteration in one's thinking skills. Someone may have sustained a blow with another player, or maybe a player hits the ground or even a piece of equipment, but typically you see a change in their thinking skills. And this doesn't necessarily have to involve a loss of consciousness, just an alteration in how the athlete thinks.
Okay, so basically, for those of us who are pretty simple about this, the brain, it slams up against the inside of the skull, right? I mean, it can't be prevented from a helmet?
Right. No, the force translates through the helmet. It's good to have the best equipment possible, but the force translates through. And actually, the type of force that is most damaging is not the force that translates directly through. It's the force that rotates the head. This type of rotational injury often is most problematic and does lead to conditions like concussion.
All right. Now, for an athlete who maybe has had a blow or maybe some whiplash against turf or the ground,
right,
what are the symptoms that this athlete might experience?
They typically have headache pain, they're dizzy, they may have balance problems, and in some cases they even have memory difficulties. More often than not, they're confused. They're confused about the situation that they're in the game. They may not know what the play was or even who they're playing. But you typically see that combination of headaches, dizziness, balance problems, and confusion, as well as memory problems in some cases.
Wow. Now, how quickly can this come on, or is this delayed? I mean, how does the athlete know?
It happens immediately. It typically happens immediately, and that's why the best strategies have some method by which they can evaluate the athlete immediately on the sideline. And what we know, though, is that most athletes want to play, so it's not uncommon for an athlete to just feel as though he or she got their bell rung and wants to stay in the game, doesn't want to come out for any number of reasons. It's all kind of expected with very competitive folks.
Right.
But typically teammates or coaches or certainly the athletic trainer and medical staff start to see these symptoms. They see the confusion. They see an athlete who looks as though he or she has been injured, and then they assess on the sideline.
Okay, so let's say they see that, or the athlete comes in and reports some symptoms. Who is generally the first person to do the sideline assessment that you talked about?
Usually that's a certified athletic trainer. There may or may not be a physician on the sideline in some types of high school sports. There typically is a physician there, but the first person on the scene is often the athletic trainer who does a screening for concussion-like symptoms immediately. And depending on the results of that screening, there's a decision made to allow the athlete to return to play or to sit them out for a period of time, including the whole game if necessary.
Right. Now, what are the risks of playing with a concussion? Because I've got a lot of concerns about this, and I don't want to scare anyone listening. But at the same time, I feel we have an obligation to fully cover this topic. So what are the risks?
Sure. It's an excellent question, especially with younger athletes, because we seem to see a higher risk with the younger athlete. That is the athlete who's playing at the high school, even the middle school level, who sustains a concussion. The risk tends to be that there's a prolongation of the symptoms if a person isn't removed from play. So instead of having the symptoms resolve naturally over a relatively brief period of time, you have someone who continues to have these symptoms over a much longer period of time. That's the general risk. The rare risk that we see, the rare event that we see periodically is something called second impact syndrome. And that's where there's a real deterioration in somebody's neurological functioning because they've had another concussion when they've been symptomatic from a prior concussion, and then you see a cascade of events which could lead to a very bad situation for the athlete.
I mean, what kind of bad are we talking about?
Well, in very rare cases, we have death. But
okay.
In other cases, you may just see a more compromised functioning of the brain and then more complications. And, well, of course, what we always worry about with the younger individual is that the consequences are extremely high for them in terms of their learning, their ability to return to what they enjoyed beforehand, let alone sports. Their whole quality of life can be affected.
Right,
so
right.
we try to be very, very careful about that extremely rare event.
Right, right. And that's when we tend to see maybe some athletes self-medicating. And I know in my office, I've seen some athletes start substance abusing at that point where maybe they were never doing anything like that before. Have you noticed a lot of that?
Well, I don't tend to see a lot of that with the athletes that we find who have had concussions, but we definitely see mood changes and the frustration. And even at the professional level, we'll see athletes who have been trained to do exactly what they are doing at the time of concussion. This is their life dream. And they have a concussion, and it removes them from the only thing that they wanted to do in their entire life. So, of course, you have a natural psychological reaction, more frustration, and all of those things just need to be managed so that the athlete can settle down and then follow a course of care that would allow them to return to play safely.
Right, right, because that's really a double whammy, because many times the athletes use their sports to help them cope when life gets tough. It's their outlet. It's the thing that brings them so much joy. And so now they've got this depressing situation, but they also can't play to relieve themselves.
You're exactly right. I mean, this is their identity. And for some of the younger athletes who are actually have a potential to play, say, at the Division I level, this is a real dream that can come crushing down, not only for them, but we often encounter just the significant reactions of the family members and even the coaching staff. And so we just try to educate individuals about the risks and try to tap down some of these strong reactions and not have somebody go back to play when they're not safe to do so.
Right, right. Now, moving on, because I want to try and get some really preventative things out there.
Sure.
If concussions can't be fully prevented, what can coaches and parents do to keep their athletes safe and ultimately, like we've been discussing, get back to the sport that they love?
Well, they can do exactly what they're doing if they're listening to this show, and that is become educated about events such as concussions and to understand what a good concussion management program would be. And that often includes involving somebody like a sports neuropsychologist on the team's medical staff and then being very clear about the standards that need to be met for an athlete to return to play safely. So the education, having the requisite expertise, and then having a very clear protocol for return to play safely. All of those things really lower the risks for concussions that become more severe over time.
Right. Now, I'm sure you're directly involved for some teams about what that protocol looks like.
Yes.
What sets the determination for return to play safely?
An athlete needs to be without symptoms upon physical exertion. So when the athlete is pushed physically by the trainer and they do not have a return to headache, pain, dizziness, balance problems, or confusion, then they're reassessed neuropsychologically. And typically we have tests that evaluate an athlete's thinking skills before they sustain a concussion, kind of like a baseline measure.
Right.
And then when they're without symptoms, they're reassessed with the same tests, maybe a different version, and if they're doing as well as they did at baseline, then the athlete is cleared to play.
Right, so when you say baseline, you mean before the head injury?
Yes, ideally we like to evaluate athletes before they have contact. So often during spring practices is a good time for some of the high school sports, especially football, or in hockey we typically evaluate them at camp when they first come into camp before the season starts.
Okay. Now, what changes are you seeing in the equipment and maybe even the rules at the professional level to protect these athletes?